Much. This is a partnership between us at UKZN and our colleagues in BirdLife South Africa, particularly Robin Collane. So human population increase requires more resources and thus more land. Land use change and habitat destruction are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss. Habitat loss often results in fragmentation and disconnection of habitats. And connectivity is critical for colonization, dispersal, gene flow, community structure, and persistence of all biodiversity. So if we unpack that a little bit, habitat disconnection creates inhibition of healthy gene flow. It creates dispersal challenges for individuals to leave their natal sites, to establish territory and breed. Creates colonization challenges for individuals to establish populations in distinct habitat patches. And over time, we can have relaxation or local extinction, where colonization is not possible for dispersal limited species. So the surrounding landscape is critical. It may permit or preclude dispersal and colonization. So climate change and land use change, these two things are going hand in hand. Land use change is compounded by anthropogenic climate change, as they have additive and synergistic effects. This drives species extinctions in similar ways, resulting in a homogenization of biodiversity. Climate change may require distribution shifts for species to track their climate niche across remnant habitat. So connectivity is key in conservation planning for buffering climate change effects and facilitating species' abilities to disperse throughout remnant habitat within their ecological niches. So deforestation for agriculture and urbanization is the greatest single driver of biodiversity loss worldwide. If we look at that in a South African context, South Africa's forest provision disproportionately high proportion of biodiversity relative to area. It's less than 1% of the total land area, but for example, 14% of all South African birds and mammals are found in forests. However, we've got a high incidence of forest conversion and fragmentation. For example, 83% of the coastal forest has already been converted and lost. So our aim was to propose surrogate taxa to guide conservation management plans for South Africa's forest biome. We aim to map connectivity between key forest patches to indicate critical habitat patches for conservation efforts, to model patch persistence likelihood under climate change scenarios, and to assess the model efficacy and provide forest connectivity improvement and forest conservation networks. So this is to promote the improvement of habitat integrity and connectivity across key forest patches. So we use surrogate taxa. Andy just spoke a little bit about surrogate taxa there. First of all, we use the bush blackcap, which is a near-threatened endemic species, and it's range restricted to our Afro-temperate and mist-belt forests. So we've got 4 classes of forest in the east side of the country. We've got Afro-temperate and mist-belt forest, coastal and scarp forest. So the bush blackcap is range restricted to the Afro-temperate and mist-belt forests. And then we have the orange ground thrush, which is least concern, and it's distributed throughout Africa wherever there's suitable habitat. But here in South Africa, it's restricted to mist-belt forest. And then we have the endangered and endemic subspecies of spotted ground thrush, which is restricted only to the coastal and scarp forests. So we looked at these surrogate taxa because A, they're forest specialized, so they represent the minimum likely tolerance threshold to forest disturbance. They're range restricted and they're habitat specific to these forest types. They have a tightly overlapping suite of functional traits: body size, diet, foraging strategy, nesting material. They're not seasonal migrants, thus they're dependent year-round on the climatic conditions and resource phenology provisioned in each respective forest type. However, they are capable of local migration to some degree and thus capable of tracking a changing or dynamic climate niche. So I've got a lot of methods. I don't want to get too deep into them. If you've got questions, maybe we can get into that afterwards. But so I'm just going to touch on each stage. So we created 3 individual ensemble species distributions of the 3 species niches. And then we mapped, based on their ecological parameters, the core habitat and then resistance or friction in the landscape that would impinge dispersal throughout the landscape. We mapped the core habitat based on minimum breeding size, looked at habitat suitability, the landscape resistance, which gave us a hybrid model of least cost pathways and ecological circuit theory mapping of habitat connectivity. So this was cost weighted to 30 kilometers with a Euclidean distance, And we used linkage mapper, pinch point mapper, and barrier mapper as a way of getting a percentage improvement score related to corridor least cost distance. We then wanted to see how robust this might be under climate change scenarios, so we coupled 4 global circulation models to 2050 together, and we ran the persistence likelihood of the forest patches under climate change scenarios, and then we used this to inform our forest connectivity conservation network, which was guided by the National Protected Area Expansion Strategy, and this looked at stable core patches under climate change, and then our forest connectivity improvement network, which was guided by the Expanded Public Works Programme and looked at areas of high effective resistance. So our first results, very difficult to see here, I'm afraid, but beautiful maps, trust me, of, on the left, the spotted ground thrush in the centre, the orange ground thrush, and on the right, the bush blackcap. So we've produced the first distribution maps for those. We've got a log threshold and a core habitat patches as well. And then we modelled the habitat patches, the core patches, persistence under climate change. And you can see the great swathes of red is where the patches contract, and the green patches are the stable patches. So you can see particularly at mid-range to high altitude ranges, there's a very high incidence of habitat contraction. This is particularly impacting the orange ground thrush. 99% of all of its patches are impacted, 93% of bush blackcap patches, 78% of spotted ground thrush patches. They're not quite so impacted on the coast. So then to see what our connectivity, pinch point, and barrier improvement mapping looks like, we take our least cost pathways and we improve that through these methods, and you can see how this expands on potential dispersal scenarios. And finally, we put all this together for these final 2 connectivity networks. So the Forest Connectivity Conservation Network, which promotes the conservation and connectivity of identified core habitat patches and corridors critical for maintaining connectivity that will most likely to remain stable under climate change projections to 2050. And then lastly on the right is the Forest Connectivity Improvement Network, and this promotes improvement of habitat integrity and connectivity across core habitat patches. And this network is weighted towards highlighting areas surrounding core habitat patches and along corridors that would most benefit overall connectivity if improved through rehabilitation efforts. So if we distill this a little bit, basically the projected habitat loss under climate change scenarios impacted core habitat patch distribution, size, and corridor connectivity, likely exacerbating habitat fragmentation. It also increased resistance along least cost paths and the severity of pinch points and barriers along dispersal corridors. So forest systems and associated surrogate species projected to experience the highest levels of habitat loss or contraction occurred at the mid to high elevations. And climate change resilience across forest classes and the persistence of species therein was dependent on connectivity, facilitating species' ability to track specific climate niches. So climate change compounds the negative effects of habitat loss and fragmentation. And while the success of protected area networks hinges on their functioning as ecologically connected network, it's critical that proposed networks are resilient to climate change predictions. And then as a final thought, anybody seen me speak before? I bang this drum a lot. Along the coast, we have a vegetation class that is unprotected called coastal dense bush. It's within the Indian Ocean coastal belt, and it is critical for connecting isolated coastal forest patches, and it urgently requires protection. It is not legally protected because it also represents, we believe, regenerating coastal forest. It has a 77% overlap in tree species, 95% overlap in mammal and bird species. The key difference is the habitat structure. It has higher incidence of saplings and seedlings, and the canopy isn't as tall, so it's more of a regeneration stage. So if we can protect this unprotected but critical vegetation class, it also falls within Peter Olivier, who used to be at University of Pretoria, and colleagues did a mapping exercise to map the distribution of coastal forest under historic, before humans fragmented and removed. And this dense bush falls directly within the barrier of projected historic forest as well. So if we can protect this, we stand a good chance of A, improving the connectivity for forest-dependent species, and also for regenerating our highly restricted and threatened forest biome. Thank you for your attention, and thanks to these people.